All right, guys. Today we are learning, or this week rather, we are learning about resources and energy on Earth. So there's two types of resources that we use to create energy. That's renewable and non-renewable resources. So the first thing we're going to talk about is fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are a non-renewable source of energy that forms within the earth over millions of years. There's three key types. We have coal, oil, and natural gas. So what I want you guys to do is write a question that you have about each type of the fossil fuel. So my example questions are for coal. How much of the electric power at our school is from coal burning plants? Oil is why do some countries have way more oil than other countries? Natural gas. How is natural gas mined and how do they compress into containers? Next, we have coal. Coal is a mineral that is formed from plants that have been fossilized. So coal is essentially dead plant matter that has, over millions of years, changed form into a mineral. So let's talk about how coal forms. It takes millions of years for coals to form. This is like a key important feature when we're talking about non-renewable resources. It takes millions of years for this to form. So it's not something that we could just do overnight. So 100 to 400 million years ago, coal started as large swamp plants. Eventually what happened is those plants died and they piled up at the bottom of the water, the bottom of the swamp. Over time, those plants then became buried underwater in layers of dirt, forming peat. So those layers kind of stacked up on top of each other, and this formed something called peat. So peat is actually something that you can get and you can burn. So for example, in Ireland, they have a lot of peat deposits. Ireland used to be much more swampy than it is now. And they actually dig up that peat and they burn it. So that's kind of what peat is. It's just old, dead plant life that has kind of started to congeal together. And then finally what happens is that heat and pressure work on that peat and they turn the plant matter slowly into coal. This is the process that takes millions of years, really. Like extended millions of years. So heat and pressure are both needed here. So what they do is they actually press by pressing things together, right? Remember, as our sediments build up, they're pressing them together. And there's heat as they get lower in our crust. And this is what actually creates the chemical change that changes our peat or plant material into coal. So what we do see in the United States is that there are large coal reserves in the US. So what does that tell us about Earth's climate in the United States in the past? Well, what we can tell is that what we now have as dry land in the US must once have contained large inland lakes, and that around these lakes there were warm, swampy areas of decaying plants. So because we had those decaying plants in those swampy inland lakes, you then now have large deposits of coal. Coal is actually the world's most abundant fossil fuel. Think about how many plants are on our planet today, and then think about over millions of years ago, how much there must have been and how that built up. So while it is abundant, it is still finite to some degree because we need to be able to, mine it. It needs to be able to form before we can mine coal. Next, we're going to talk more about non-renewable resources. Non-renewable resource is a resource that does not regenerate or does not do so quickly enough to serve human needs in a maintainable way, right? So we're looking at things like gas, we're looking at coal, we're looking at oil, right? These are all things that are finite. Yes, we will get more of each of these, but it's going to take a long time. And if we get rid of it all too quickly or we burn it all very quickly, we're not going to have enough long term, right? We also want to think about how oil, gas, and other fossil fuels, how they actually help us power our electricity, right? Things like coal actually powers most of our electrical plants. They help us create energy, right? We use oil or gas for transportation. We also know that as we burn our fossil fuels, we have pollution that contributes to climate change. And that while this is true, it's also basically what our economic industry is currently built off of. We're very dependent on things like cars and therefore oil and gas. But ultimately, because these are non-renewable, it's unsustainable. We can't rely on non-renewable resources forever. Eventually, they will vanish. So that's going to have us talk about petroleum. So petroleum is a liquid found in rock strata, or like a layer of rock below Earth's surface, which can be refined to produce fuels. So petroleum is actually two different words in Latin pushed together: petra, which means rock, and oleum, which is oil. And much like our coal, this takes millions of years to form. So we can see in my first picture here, tiny marine life lived millions of years ago, right? So they were just chilling at the bottom of the ocean or lakes, things like that. And then what happens is, as they died, they were slowly buried under layers of sediment. So you can see here we have a lot of plant and animal remains, and then we have sediment on top and new life up above. What eventually happens is that over millions of years, that heat and pressure turn decaying organisms into oil and gas. As those living things die, they release gas. And so typically we see oil or petroleum and gas near each other because of that buildup of gas. So very similar to coal, except now we're talking about animal marine life versus plants. But again, key piece here has to do with water, right? The presence of water. So the places where we see the largest oil reserves on our planet are Venezuela, Canada, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran. Saudi Arabia actually, I believe, has the largest oil reserve at the moment. So when we look at these areas, it actually tells us something about our past. Continental drift moved areas that once had aquatic life and mild climates to areas closer to the poles and with drier climates. So what we actually see is three of the largest oil reserves are Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran, right? These are all in the Middle East. That area is very much a desert. What we're using our theory of continental drift to prove is that once these areas had much more water, and therefore now that they have less water, we're able to access those oil deposits much easier. So that is it for our fossil fuels and on our part, but there's other non-renewable resources that we need to think of. So one is ores. Ores are rocks that contain large amounts of minerals, usually metal, that make it profitable to extract the mineral from the surrounding rocks. Ores are created through the rock cycle by cooling, crystallization, heat and pressure. So again, we see those heat and pressure are key pieces in ores. Some ores are formed by rock exposed to very hot water and hydrothermal vents deep in the ocean. So light bulbs actually contain copper, zinc, tungsten, and tin, right? So we can find copper in Chile, zinc in the United States, tungsten in Portugal, and tin in China. And over here, you guys have a little chart on some of the most common ores that we mine: copper, tin, zinc, tungsten, and iron, and where you can find them. And we basically depend on Earth's resources as humans. If we can't grow it, we have to mine it, right? So there are some things that we've discovered we can kind of recreate or grow in a lab setting, especially like gems, right? Jewels, things like that, rubies, diamonds, emeralds. We have found ways to reproduce those in a lab environment, but we have not been able to do that very effectively with ores. So we really do have to go out and mine those ores ourselves. So here you can see we're looking specifically at copper. Where is copper most abundant? So copper is most abundant, we can see, around the ring of fire. And even kind of these X's here, that used to be the edge of the Pacific plate, right? But as it grew, remember our plates grow and shrink, those deposits were moved further to the center of another plate. So you can use this little QR code to find another map of copper deposits. And really what we're seeing is that copper ores are concentrated along plot boundaries, particularly the boundaries that make up the Ring of Fire. So we know that copper is most abundant in areas where there is a lot of this volcanic activity along our plate boundaries. Now we're going to talk about something called geological process. So before we get to that directly, we need to think about what we as humans rely on our Earth for. So in our ocean, we rely on things like fish for food. We also rely on ocean plants to absorb carbon dioxide and release oxygen. In our atmosphere, we rely on the atmosphere to protect us from UV radiation. We also rely on the atmosphere to make our climate range and to make our planet livable. Without the, oh my gosh, my brain has just died. Without the atmosphere, we wouldn't be here, right? Think of Mars. Mars is a very thin atmosphere, and we don't really see plant or animal life on that planet. I mean, I know we're trying to go there, but we definitely wouldn't be able to walk around on Mars with out of spacesuit. Finally, for our biosphere, we have plants that we rely on for food, and plants also have photosynthesis, which creates oxygen and pulls out CO2 from the air. And here's what we really want to think about for this next half. How do geological processes impact where resources are located? So everything that we've talked about so far is non-renewable resources, right? These are things that are going to take a long time to either create again, or they will never be created again. But geological process is a process at work in Earth's landforms and surfaces. Geological processes are responsible for high concentrations of resources in some locations and not a lot in others. So these processes basically work to create pockets of a specific resource. What we do as humans is we find those areas that geological processes have created, pockets or areas or reserves of those things, and we extract them, typically through mineral extraction. So mineral extraction is just mining to remove their valuable raw material that we as humans need. Mineral extraction occurs at things like strip mines, quarries, and underground mines. Mining involves the removal of large amounts of waste rock to remove the desired material. So we do need to remove lots of rock to get to those deposits. And what this actually ends up happening is it creates surface and groundwater pollution and erosion. So you can see that the positives of mining, minerals are needed for production and construction, and it's profitable. It gives us jobs. It gives us economy. But there are also some pretty big negatives, right? Contamination and pollution of the planet, erosion, so wearing down of the surface of the planet, habitation destruction, so animals don't have a place to go, and resource depletion. Eventually, that mine's going to run dry. We're going to run out of material to mine. And then all of that industry that has built up around there now has nothing, right? Let's look at water distribution. So groundwater is a resource that we have. All that groundwater is water that seeps through the soil and is stored in underground aquifers. Aquifers are reservoirs for groundwater. It's made of rock that lets water pass through. So some rocks are more porous than others that allow water to gather. That's how we kind of have this shell or basin in which water collects in. Precipitation is a key piece in this. Precipitation is different based on local climate, though. So if you have a lot of rainfall in an area, you're going to have more water in an aquifer than you are in an area with little rainfall. So thinking about these things, what is a factor in resource distribution? All that resource distribution is the arrangement of resources on Earth. Both past and present geological and climate impact the location of resources. So, for example, when we look at groundwater will always be plentiful in regions with higher annual precipitation. If you start to see climate changing in an area and less rainfall, then because you have less groundwater, the environment of that area is going to change, right? Metals we know are abundant in areas with strong tectonic activity, and fossil fuels are formed by the deposition of ancient living things in sedimentary rocks. But we know that our resource distribution is not equally spread across our planet. And it's not fair, right? We know that not everybody is going to have access to the same resources. There are global consequences of unevenly distributed resources. Typically, people are going to settle near resources needed for survival, which means that if there aren't any resources in a particular area, you're probably not going to have people settling there. It's going to be more expensive in our economy to settle there potentially. Local economics are going to vary by resources. So you might have a fishing town, right? A mining town, a farming town. And once those resources run out, you're not going to have the same opportunities. Wealth and quality of living vary by resource availability, right? So you might have an area that has more of a resource than another. They're going to have more wealth and therefore a better quality of living because of it. And ultimately, this can lead to war and conflict over resources. So think of things like gold, oil, and diamonds. Next time, we're going to be talking about renewable resources, but please make sure that you have filled in all of the pieces of your worksheet. That is everything that I have for you guys today. I will talk with you more later. Bye.